So as Joe mentioned, I'm faculty in the Department of Medicine and also the Department of Philosophy. I teach medical students, residents, philosophy students, and also run a Brain Initiative funded neuroethics lab. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all today about the ethics of invasive human neuroscience research. I'll try to stop at around 45 minutes and then hopefully we can have a nice discussion at the end. So what we'll do today is to give an outline, I'll give a broad overview of the ethical considerations in invasive human neuroscience studies. I'll present some of the work that my lab is doing with various patient populations. So this includes work with patients who volunteer to participate in research during a neurosurgery operation, so during the implantation of a deep brain stimulator device, for example. And then if we have time, we'll talk about some of my lab's work with patients who are part of early feasibility studies with visual cortical prosthetic devices. I'll try to motivate for you today how we might ethically improve this research and the technology itself by paying closer attention to patient perspectives and what we can do about incorporating their values and their narratives into the translational process from beginning to end. I'll try to convince you that this area of research is really ethically challenging, that it deserves its own ethics talk today, that we cannot simply kind of take our practices of consent and recruitment from other areas of research and kind of plop them into this space. But instead that taking these ethical questions seriously requires really like robust collaborative teams to work together. And so speaking of teams, this is my team at UCLA. As I mentioned before, I run a neuroethics lab here, and my lab works on the ethics of basic intracranial human research. So this is research that aims to answer questions that are fundamental questions about how the brain works, not research that's aimed to provide a therapeutic benefit for patients. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. We ask questions about consent, why participants join these studies, what they value. In general, what types of risks are permissible to subject participants to. And to this end, we work in close collaboration with a bunch of different types of researchers. So my co-PI is Dr. Nader Paradian, who's now at UT Southwestern Medical Center. But we have wonderful philosophy postdocs, medical students, folks with PhDs in bioethics, neuroscience degrees, and we also work with scholars at the Anderson School of Management, so Eugene Caruso and Megan Weber, who've been really critical in addressing some of these basic questions about decision making. If we have some time, I'll talk about more of our collaborative work with some of the other folks you see here. So one thing that we've done recently is work really closely in connection with the Research Opportunities in Humans Consortium of the NIH. So we'll hopefully have some time to talk about that work as well. And the work I'll talk today is funded by Brain Initiative. One is an RF1 and the other is a supplemental study to a parent grant with Dr. Paradian, Dr. Jesse Dorn from Second Sight as well. Probably worth mentioning, we use a lot of different methodologies. So we use qualitative methodologies, quantitative studies, but also philosophical methods. So we ask questions like, which research practices, which kind of translational practices are justified. We engage in conceptual analysis. So we ask questions like, what does it mean for some technology to be invasive? And how might different people mean different things by that across different populations? Is it just kind of how far it cuts into the brain? Does it have to do with the information that we're recording from, stuff like that? So as I mentioned before, the kinds of research that my lab focuses on is basic intracranial human neuroscience studies. So this is research that's aimed at answering a fundamental scientific question about the brain, not research that's aimed at providing a clinical benefit to participants. And it's research that involves recording or stimulation inside the human skull. So these kinds of studies are conducted in close concert with neurosurgical interventions. and in fact currently require the involvement of neurosurgical patients, right? So patients who have implanted wires or devices already implanted. And these patients provide researchers with really rare and unique opportunities to peer into the human brain in ways that would otherwise be impermissible, right? So it's currently, we could question that and we could talk about that, but it's currently, I probably cannot enroll in one of these studies because currently I don't have a clinical need for some of these interventions. That's an interesting question, actually. And we may have had some examples of folks who wanted to volunteer for some of these studies that don't have a clinical need for a surgical intervention. So here are some of the examples of the studies with implantable devices that my lab asks questions about. So researchers in column 1. So researchers may take extra recordings from a therapeutically implanted device. So this may be the case if researchers take advantage of patients with chronic implants, so patients with RNS systems who then kind of have completed their surgical implantation, but then maybe come into a lab to perform extra tasks, and researchers can record from that technology. Researchers might take recordings through the modification of a clinically indicated implant for research purposes. So for example, we might modify wires used to detect individual neurons firing. We might use that with patients who are already have wires implanted to monitor their seizure activity. So this would be the case if you had a patient who was in the epilepsy monitoring unit, who was there for a week, and researchers can take advantage of some of the invasive technology that's used for clinical purposes to then ask patients to perform some more tasks, right, to learn basic things about the brain. In column 3, researchers may take recordings through placing extra temporary implants. So for example, this is a picture of a temporary, I think, ECOG strip placed during DBS surgery, patient with Parkinson's disease. And the patient may be asked to kind of complete various movements, tasks, or something like that during their surgery. So this is, an intraoperative research setting. And 4, let's see if I can kind of see my screen. 4 is a little bit different, right? So 4 is a case where research is conducted as part of an investigational device trial. So this would be the case where we would have patients who have a Utah array, for example, implanted for a BCI trial, but then also participate in some basic science research that make use of that implantation. It's worth looking at this slide. So here's the patients that make this research possible. Figure out how to monitor this for a second. I want to see your faces, but I can't really see. There we go. So in the first column, we have a patient who is wearing a kind of mobile device that works in conjunction with a NeuroPace RNS system, who may come to the lab to participate in research about memory, right, formation. In 2, we have a patient who is participating in basic science research in the epilepsy monitoring unit, participating in research about emotion and vision. In the 3rd column, we have an intraoperative setting. So we have a patient who is moving a joystick during their DBS implantation surgery, participating in basic science about cognition, for example. And in 4, we have a patient who is using kind of brain or neural control to play a piano based on basic science decoding principles derived from ongoing research. So this research is really diverse, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's kind of all united by 3 things. All of this research shares the goal of understanding basic science questions about the brain. There is an absence of near-term therapeutic benefit. And the research makes use of intracranial recordings and stimulation in human subjects who either have a clinical need for neurosurgical intervention or whose condition allows them to undergo one for the sake of a study. And that we can talk about in a little bit. That's a kind of a special case. It's worth kind of pausing for a second. So as technology develops and invasive technical capabilities expand, we know that things are expanding rapidly. We just heard last week about a kind of novel DBS trial for chronic back pain, right? And kind of a new way of using DBS in that regard. as we learn more about the brain and the conditions that these techniques can address, there will be more and more patients, not only with these implanted devices, but also more patients to provide opportunities to do research. And that's actually quite interesting. I think the session last week about DBS for chronic pain, that was a clinical trial implanting a DBS device in the affective part of the brain. And I observed that research, I observed that implantation surgery, and that patient also participated in intraoperative research. So in this third category, basic science research to learn something else about the brain. And part of that research was made possible by the fact that the device was in the affective part of the brain. So that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. More and more opportunities to conduct this type of research and a wider range of questions that we could ask. So I like to look at this chart and use it as a way to not only appreciate the differences between these types of studies, but also as we kind of walk through it, we can start to appreciate how specific and unique and maybe sticky some of the ethical questions are that this type of research raises. So kind of down the left, we have a list of features of some of these studies in humans that we might think are particularly ethically salient. And then across, as you go horizontally, these are kinds of questions you could ask to bring out what might be different or important about your particular study, for example, or to appreciate the types of ethical questions we might need to pay attention to. So I'm not going to go through all of this today, but we could just kind of walk through it a little bit. So in the first column, we have risks. So we could appreciate how the risks vary across those 4 types of studies we just looked at. If we take the chronic implant patients, there's almost no surgical risk, right? Because those patients have the device implanted. They may still be participating in therapy, but they're out of the surgical environment, come to the lab to participate in research. So there's almost no additional surgical risks, but there are some risks, right? So some of you may know this better than me. I don't work with this patient population yet, but their batteries may drain faster. They maybe have to pause therapy depending on the timing of the research study. How do we think about those risks in the context of enrolling patients? How should we talk about those risks with patients so that they understand what they're participating in? We might compare those risks to the risks, say, of a BCI study where the patient assumes all of the surgical risk for the sake of the study. That's kind of like 2 ends of the spectrum. Or we might think about intraoperative research, where it's actually kind of a tricky question to quantify the extra risk of research conducted in the operating room. So in some moods, the risks are quite low. And I think there was a recent study that came out about this, about how actually increased risks of stroke and things that you associate with being in the OR are actually quite minimal and maybe not realized. But those risks are kind of hard to quantify and maybe hard to communicate to patients. So we know the longer that you are having open brain surgery in the OR, the higher your risk of infection and stroke and other surgical related risks. But exactly how long correlates with exactly how much extra risk is a little bit of a tricky thing to try to quantify and let alone communicate to patients. Sometimes the risks, we don't actually quite even know what the full spectrum of risks are. So maybe this is an early feasibility study. And part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand whether the device is safe and feasible, right? And we could walk down. I think benefits is an interesting category. My lab is really interested in thinking about benefits and thinking about how do we weigh benefits against risk. So for these studies, there's no therapeutic benefits for the patient. So the patient says, yes, of course, I will participate in this research during my DBS surgery, but their condition is not going to improve as a result of this research participation, and they take on some extra risks. But we might ask, what are the other kinds of benefits? Are there other benefits to participating in these studies that are not necessarily therapeutic? So there's interesting studies done with patients who are in some of these longer term studies. So a BCI study might last for years and might be kind of a source of social interaction for some of these patients. And they may derive benefit from feeling like they're part of a team, that they're contributing to science? How should we think about that in the overall kind of permissibility of some of these studies? This is kind of a nuanced point, but I think it's important to think about. The benefits of all of these studies come in the form of knowledge, right? So the benefit is the knowledge to be gained about some scientific question about the brain. That question could be closer or farther away from the participant's own condition. So maybe researchers are trying to understand Parkinson's disease and the patient is having DBS surgery for Parkinson's, but they may be trying to understand emotion, and the patient is in the operating room for something entirely different, like movement disorder. And that's tricky and interesting whether patients understand that relationship. And how do we talk about that with patients? The patient population is quite different in all of these studies, right? So how does the diagnosis of the patients themselves change how we should think about consent, how we should think about the development of the technology, how we should think about whether that population is vulnerable to perhaps taking on more risk than maybe they ought to. Some of the diagnoses may come with kind of cognitive symptoms, right? So how might that compromise patients' ability to kind of consent to some of this research? I think this is interesting too. I'm not going to pick on Dr. Bari, but he said it was okay if I discussed his research a bit. So in the study last week also, we talked about DBS for chronic back pain. That's a very particular patient population. And not only that, but those patients have to fail multiple other kinds of interventions before they can be considered a candidate for this trial. And so what does that mean about the types of vulnerabilities that patient is bringing with them when they're in the operating room and when they are approached to participate in more stuff, right? Team constitution is also quite important, and it varies across all those types of studies. Do you have a high prevalence of clinician investigators? This is something that my lab is also really interested in, thinking of the duality of the very same person having clinical responsibilities to the patient, so in the OR, for example, but then also being the lead PI on the research. And what does that mean for thinking about conflicts of interest, thinking about how to protect patients and how to talk to patients about that in a way that doesn't influence them? Maybe there's kind of the opposite in some of these chronic implant studies, right? Maybe there's a high prevalence of non-clinician investigators. And what does that mean also for thinking about enrolling patients in these studies? These studies also have various relationships between care and research, right? So we've talked about this a lot by now, but the kind of, to me, the single most fascinating about this research is that the therapeutic intervention and the research are happening in really close connection with each other, but that's closer or farther depending on which type of research you're studying. Sometimes we think about this in terms of timing, is the research happening within the clinical event, within the surgery, next to it, after it, stuff like that. The space that the research is happening in, if the research is happening in a clinical space, how might that matter? How might that inform what types of things we need to do for patients? So for example, you might think the fact that patients are participating in some of this research in the OR, in the surgery, while their head is in a frame where they physically cannot move and they're seeing all the same faces, may really, really change how you talk to that patient about joining the study. It may change who's in the room with that patient, right? There's people, representatives from tech companies, there's researchers. Maybe we would think about how to train our non-clinical staff to be in that very kind of sacred clinical space. And I said I wasn't going to go through this, but I think it's useful, so I'm going to. Different levels of participant involvement. This one is interesting. I hadn't really thought about it until a recent conversation I just had with another colleague, which was, it's not just how long the participation is. So if you thought about those 4 types of studies, intraoperative research, one time, maybe it's 30 minutes is their participation in that study. That's how much extra time the research study takes place. AMU could be over a period of weeks, BCI is over a period of years. But then there's also the like the intensity of involvement and the quality of that involvement. Some of participating in some of this research might be quite taxing, distressing, difficult. There's some data from patients in BCI studies for movement, for trying to kind of move a robotic arm, and talking about how that participation affected their sense of agency. They were exhausted after thinking about that. What does that mean for what we might owe patients in these studies? So thinking about all these nuances and all of these details has given rise to a host of ethical concerns that have been kind of noted in the literature and that my lab is quite interested in. But when I say ethical concerns, I mean concerns about what we ought to do, not necessarily concerns about what we can do, right? So you can kind of look around this space and you can probably tell what the ethical questions are associated with these tabs. Many people at the kind of front end of this research, people are mostly concerned with consent, right? Given the fact that the research is happening in really close connection with clinical care, how do we make sure that patients understand what they're participating in and that their consent is voluntary? How do we think about influences on patient decision-making? This is interesting. We can talk a little bit about it in a second, but what would it take for patients to be able to kind of freely decline? And what does that mean, thinking, whether you're in an EMU setting or you're in the middle of a surgery? And what would we really have to do to make that a kind of meaningful opportunity for patients to decline or stop research? Questions about patient participant understanding. Do participants understand the goals of these studies? They're non-therapeutic. They're sometimes answering really nuanced and complicated questions about neuroscience or about the brain. How much do patients understand? How much should we expect them to understand for their consent to be kind of informed? We discussed effects on like senses of agency and identity. That might be even more so in certain disability populations. So devices that aim to kind of restore or provide artificial vision for the blind community. How might some of those technological advancements affect patients' sense of identity? And can we think about that a little bit before we implant a bunch of people with these devices? What is the acceptable risk-benefit ratio? I find that to be incredibly interesting, and I think there's no calculus for working out what an acceptable risk-benefit ratio is. There's some guidance from the Federal Common Rule, but it's a bit of an open question. And the people who get to make those determinations are the scientific community, right? We don't have a lot of data on what patients think is an acceptable risk-benefit ratio, and they may feel very differently. Concerns about exploitation. So anytime that we have one group of people taking on a burden for the purposes of another group of people, so this could be for the purposes of science, for the benefit to society, or also for future patients down the line, we can ask questions about whether we're taking advantage of one group in that way, and how could we kind of work against that. Questions about disability and justice. So questions about as we develop some of this technology, as we take advantage of some of these neurosurgical opportunities, what types of views are we bringing to the table about normalcy, about suffering, about disability, and about difference, right? And this bleeds into the set of questions below, is thinking really about technology as, in a way, being able to kind of shape what we think of as normal function in the future. So these are a bit more of like forward-looking ethical questions, and my lab engages with them to some extent. We tend to sit more in the space of consent and acceptable risk-benefit ratio, but these are important questions, and I think in some ways kind of really fun to think about, and also important for people involved in the translational process at the tech level to think about. The last few I think are really interesting. I'll just stop with permissible goals. I think there's an open question what type of research we should be doing and what type of technology we should be developing. And as I said before, as the kind of capabilities expand rapidly into new spaces of the brain and new questions we can answer, We can ask questions about thoughts, feelings, emotions, distress, stuff like that. Should we be developing tech that could do that? And those are kind of broader questions I feel like you kind of open with to hook people into this topic, but they're very much kind of real in our lab. These are the areas that my lab tends to sit in. And I want to focus a little bit, so kind of narrow into some of the projects that we've been doing. And I'd like to focus just on one ethical question in one type of study. So I'd like to talk a little bit about consent in intraoperative studies. Kind of the two main pillars of consent for research ethics is that patients participate in ways that are informed, or the decision to participate is informed and voluntary. And I think this type of research, intraoperative research, basic intraoperative research, raises questions on both of these pillars of consent and should make us concerned or at least perplexed about whether we actually can meet these requirements in the case of these studies. So first, as we mentioned before, there may be questions about capacity, right? So there may be questions about patients' ability to weigh the risks and the benefits of this research in ways that are kind of rational and would count as being informed. Capacity in the clinical context is decision specific, right? So you could have capacity, say, you could have enough cognitive capacity to consent to having a deep brain stimulation device implanted to help with Parkinson's or epilepsy or treatment-resistant depression. But maybe we might question whether you have the capacity to understand the nuances of the research study that we're going to ask you to do in that context. And that's actually something that my group has struggled with a lot. I mean, how would we do this? How would we kind of have capacity assessments for these kind of separate areas? And what would it look like to really take that seriously? In the research opportunities in humans consortium that I work with, none of those investigators, so many of them are clinician scientists and many of them do this type of research, none of them had thought about assessing capacity for research participation kind of separately from capacity for therapeutic intervention. And it's quite an interesting topic. We might also worry about understanding. We talked about this a little bit, and so we don't have to spend a lot of time here. But I think it's really in the space of intraoperative research, a really tricky area. Patients may not understand that their care and their research are separate, in part because they're going to happen during the same event in the OR. Sometimes the tasks that patients are asked to do as part of the study are almost identical to the tasks that they're asked to do or that they would do as part of just kind of normal testing of the device. And so if they can't separate those two, the thought would be something like they can't decline from one of them, or they can't raise questions about one of them. And that's a real concern. They may not understand that their care will not be compromised if they decline to research participation, and that their care will still be optimal even if they do or don't join. Concerns about research participants joining studies in ways that are voluntary has kind of equal levels of concern, right? So when we think about whether the decision to join a study is voluntary, sometimes what we have in mind is making sure that participants, there isn't any undue influence on their decision-making, so that they don't feel pressure to join, that they are joining out of a kind of rational, deliberative process that may be very difficult to ensure in this context, in part because in the intraoperative studies, there is such a high prevalence of surgeon investigators, right? So the very same person who's going to offer this therapy to a patient who may have suffered for very many years and received no relief from any other therapy, that same person is going to approach them and ask them if they want to participate in research. While we're doing this wonderful thing for you, and now I'm kind of coloring it to kind of make it sensational, by the way, there's this research study that I'm also a part of. Would you mind doing that? And And that's a really difficult thing to navigate. And we'll see in the next slide, there's no consensus really about how to navigate it. And lastly, we talked about this a little bit already, but thinking about the right to withdraw. What does it actually really mean to give patients who are in the operating room, who have, depending on when the research study is, it could be after the device is implanted. So the surgeon does everything they need to do. You're basically done. You could close up and now you have your deep brain stimulation device for your chronic back pain. But instead, let's stay open for a little bit longer so we could take advantage of this really important opportunity. What would it really mean for patients to have a meaningful opportunity to say no at that point? That is also a very challenging thing that we are struggling with in our lab right now. So all of these questions are kind of compounded by the fact that there is no consensus currently on best practices for consent and recruitment in basic intraoperative studies. So questions like who should approach the patient for participation? Who should do the consent? Who should be talking about the risks and the benefits and the study purposes? Should it be the surgeon? Should it absolutely not be the surgeon? And this sounds a bit kind of sensationalized, but this is a situation that has happened. So we've had cases where there's multi-institutional studies, and for one of the IRBs, the guidance was that the surgeon absolutely has to do the consent because the surgeon is the person who knows the most about the risks, who knows the most about the kind of relationship between the clinical intervention and the research. So of course that person should do the consent. And we've had other sites say absolutely not, basically anybody but the surgeon, because the conflict of interest is so great that patients won't feel free to decline. So I have on the board here hybrid consent. So something people have been experimenting with is maybe there's some kind of combination of different people, some, separating the consent in space and time, really trying to navigate this in ways that let this research still happen, but really take seriously that patients really may not be able to say no if it's their surgeon. And then there's some other questions here. Questions about ongoing consent processes. Is consent something that should be this kind of iterative process throughout time? If so, who should do it? Should you reconsent right before you do the research? So that's that moment where the patient is in the clamp, in the kind of frame, and now it's time to do the research and you have to switch to this kind of investigator researcher mindset. Should the patient have an opportunity to reconsent right then? And if so, who should do it? And that might look different depending on if you're in the OR, the EMU. Okay, so I hope I've at least problematized this issue of consent for cases of intraoperative studies. So I want to share a study with you. This is not from my lab. It's a recent study that was in the American Journal of Bioethics Empirical Research. And it's a study which is aimed at assessing how well participants in these basic intraoperative research studies can recall things that they discussed during their informed consent conversation, right? So this is a study by Wexler, and she interviewed 22 patients who participated in research during their DBS surgery. And she interviewed them 1 week after the informed consent process for the research. So just 1 week later. And they found that only 22.7% of the participants correctly recalled the study risks. Only 36.4% correctly recalled the study purpose. 50% recalled the study protocol. So what they will be doing, what tasks they would be asked to do, stuff like that. And 36.4% understood correctly or correctly recalled the study benefits. I think my lab has been pretty critical of this study, but it's really striking. And I can't see your faces because I've shared my screen, so I can't tell if we're all shocked or if we're like, yeah, whatever. But this pretty concerning. So even though this doesn't necessarily represent what patients understood at the time that they had the consent conversation, because it's a week later and they could have forgotten and stuff like that, they were interviewed. This interview is 5 days before their surgery. So even if it doesn't represent what they knew at the time of consent, it does represent what they can recall about what they're about to do, right? What they're about to participate in the middle of their surgery. And I think it's pretty striking data about the state of patients' understanding when they go into the surgical environment to help us advance our scientific understanding of the brain. So our lab also interviewed a set of patients who participated in intraoperative research. We interviewed them as part of a larger study. We weren't trying to kind of assess how much they could recall about informed consent. We were trying to understand what things are important to them. So when patients volunteer for these studies, why do they do it? What's important to them? What risks are permissible? What risks would they think are too much? What questions do they think we should be asking? We really wanted to understand why they do this and if we could kind of learn from that. But and this is a very small part of a larger project. So we aim to interview patients in all other types of contexts. So the chronic implant patients, the patients in the EMU, for example. And we also aim to talk to investigators to get a kind of fuller understanding of what types of values all parties kind of bring into the space. But this group of patients, this 15 patients that we interviewed, had striking answers. And even though we didn't even really ask about consent, I want to share with you some of the themes that came up from their responses. And I want to share with you their kind of narratives of what they talked to us about, what it was like, what types of things they said, because I think it's pretty striking. And we didn't expect to find many of these things. So this is part of our R01 study. So Dr. Paradian is my co-PI, and this subpart is a qualitative interview that we conducted with 15 participants who agreed to participate in basic science research during their DBS implantation surgery. And they had a variety of diagnoses. So this is Parkinson's patients, dystonia patients, epilepsy, and across 2 different sites as well. So the first theme that came out of these interviews was patients had minimal concerns with risk. So not that they just didn't recall risks, they just weren't concerned with them. So I'll read some of these quotes. So I didn't really think about that. If there was a risk, they would have stopped, or they wouldn't have done something like that. I mean, they wouldn't just keep asking me questions if there were risks. No, it didn't occur to me. I personally don't feel as if I had any increased risk in participating. The second theme was a minimal understanding of the study. So this is kind of consistent with the Wexler study, right? So when asked, what was the purpose of the study that you joined? I have no idea. I don't know what they were doing at all. Maybe they're mapping the brain. Maybe they're just training somebody how to apply an electrode. I have no idea. I just trust that somebody's getting something out of it. I don't know what the heck I've contributed to it, but I feel good about it, okay? There's not a whole lot of information out there on it, so why not? I liked being part of something obviously bigger than myself. Ease of decision to join. This is an interesting one too. So we asked them, how did you decide to participate? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Did you give it much thought? And I really like this one, although Dr. X just asked nicely, would you like to be a part of this? And I went, sure, it's a study and it'll further knowledge. That's what I'm all about. Dr. X did say, you can take a minute to think about it. And I was like, I don't need to, just put me in the study. Notably, no patient was under what we call the therapeutic misconception. So the therapeutic misconception it was coined, I guess, by Applebaum, maybe in the 70s. Somebody on here probably knows better than me. But it basically refers to this persistent kind of cognitive bias that research participants have, where they kind of persistently think that their participation is going to benefit them, when in fact it is not, right? When it's for the purposes of generalizable knowledge, right? But none of the patients seemed to be under that conception, or at least didn't report things that suggested that. They cited the goals of the study as being to help others, to increase our knowledge about the brain. None of them regretted participating. They didn't seem to be particularly bothered by the fact that they couldn't say much more about the study goals. And this is an interesting set of themes as well. When talking about their motivations for participating, they said things like how important basic science research is. what an impact their experience with their clinical diagnosis has had on their lives, and wanting to give back to science. So here's some quotes. So under importance of basic science, you never know the way research is. They could find a cure tomorrow or 10 years down the road, or they could never find a cure. But I feel as myself as being like a donor. If part of my body can help save somebody else, that's great. It may not benefit me, but it might benefit someone down the road. Half of the people I was dealing with in my local Parkinson's Association over the years passed away. I guess I'm doing it in their memory. I think that's why I did it. You feel good that you're able to do something that helps someone else down the line. Somebody's benefiting from it. And I'm the benefit of 1 million people going through tests. Somebody has to be the first to do something. So this is a really interesting set of data, right? Again, they're like kind of can't recall a lot about the study, but also not really confused about the purpose of the study at all. I'm going to share one last, in the interest of time, just one last theme that came out of these interviews. I'm not going to read all of these quotes, but I'm sharing it because I think it's the most shocking thing that came out. We didn't ask about this. We didn't ask about trust at all, but it came up persistently throughout all of the interviews. So again, I'm not going to read all of these, but these quotes just kind of demonstrate the really central role that trust between the patient and the surgeon, trust that the patient felt with their surgeon, with their research team, with the institution. So the fact that it was at UCLA or X or Y institution, trust in the research process, that even though they didn't quite know what the purpose of the study was, they kind of trusted translational science in a way that was quite interesting. And the trust that they felt in their surgeon sometimes extended like to the people that the surgeon would trust, right? So this is an interesting quote on the side. Even if it wasn't Dr. X leading the study, even if there was somebody he trusted, if there was somebody he trusted, that was good enough for me. I mean, I might have asked one more question, like if this was your kid, would you recommend this person? But I don't think he would have had somebody in there that he didn't trust and could mess up what he was doing. Right? Some quotes at the top. If I didn't trust him, then I wouldn't have agreed to the surgery done at all. So I'm trusting him with that. And if this is a way that I can help anybody else, this is quite interesting. There's much more quotes about trust in this area that are kind of giving us a broader picture of what patients are bringing into that kind of consent interaction and what it's like for them to think about joining research in a position we might think is pretty compromising. They're pretty vulnerable in this state. So what does all of this mean, right? So I don't know, because we're in the middle of our grant about it and we haven't kind of put this out in publication yet. But I think, I mean, I could give a pretty controversial way of thinking about it. I mean, I guess one controversial way to interpret this is to say patients who are approached in this context to participate in research during their surgery in general will say yes. And now that's actually relying on some other data that I didn't present, but I think it's something like 80% of patients who are approached to participate wind up participating. And we know this, we've tried to think about talking to patients who have declined, and it's quite a small number. And the ones who say yes very quickly, almost immediately, and almost with no discussion with other people outside the person doing the consent, so outside of the surgeon or the investigator. So, you know, what does that mean? Well, worst case scenario, patients just will participate with maybe underappreciating the risks and not really quite understanding what they're participating in. Best case scenario are also doing it out of a sense of wanting to help other people and a kind of valuing of basic science. So, you know, part of what my lab is working on and part of what our collaborations with other investigators and neurosurgeons is trying to kind of produce is a set of practices or guidelines or a framework for how we might kind of approach talking to patients, talking with them about the research in ways that are responsive to some of this information, right? Maybe we need to kind of talk about the risks in different ways if patients aren't really paying attention to them. Maybe we don't need to have the patients know much more about the goal of the study. Maybe this is sufficient. There is also no consensus on what would count as sufficient understanding for informed consent. We have some guidelines, right? But the nuances of it are unclear. So that's part of the kind of trajectory of this project is to take this information from patients once we kind of know where patients are at in some of these studies, and to then integrate that information into best practices. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this, but I just want to share my group, in conjunction with the ROH Consortium, has just published a paper in Neuron where we try to do exactly that. We try to outline a framework that investigators and diverse teams who are participating in this research and conducting it could use to think about their practices and kind of ground what they're doing in some ethical principles. So this is an example of how the kind of framework would work. You have a kind of fundamental commitment on the left, things that should kind of guide all of your design practices. And so the first one is maintaining the integrity of clinical care in space, which is an interesting one that a group of investigators came up with, because this is a group of scientists who have been funded to conduct research. And they propose that the most fundamental principle is that it's clinical care first. And that's interesting. The principles in the middle are meant to kind of generate some general principles that you should be responsive to. And then on the right, you'll have some examples of practices that group either uses to kind of try to maintain that principle. So the first one, clinical care and research should be uncoupled, such that care be neither compromised by nor conditional on research participation. Okay, that seems kind of obvious, but then how would you actually translate that into practice? And so you'll see on the right side some practices that the group of investigators use, and some proposed practices that they think could make their research better. We have one other kind of table which we can look at after, or I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested in it. In the interest of time, I think what I'll do now is, because I want to have some time for questions, I think I'll just briefly introduce in like 2 minutes, some of the other work that my lab is doing. And again, we are interviewing patients, but this time we're interviewing patients who are participants in an early feasibility visual cortical prosthesis trial. So this is in collaboration with Second Sight Medical Products, and also, again, Dr. Karadian. And so this is a device, it's an implanted device that's meant to provide artificial vision for patients who have acquired blindness through disease or injury. And it's in its kind of early feasibility stage. So there were 6 patients implanted, 1 has since been explanted, and 4 agreed to talk with us. And we're asking similar questions, right? Why do you participate? What do you value about this type of research? What types of risks do you think are permissible? What types of benefits or functional goals would be most meaningful to you? And you might think that, like, we should already know that answer when we developed the device in the first place, but we actually don't. And it turns out that they have a lot of very useful and interesting things to say about what would make the device provide the most benefit for them. I won't go through this slide, but just to give you an overview of the study, we kind of have 2 phases. The first phase, like I said, is to interview the 4 patients who are in the study. And we may go back and interview them multiple times as their views may change. And the second phase is to interview broader individuals from the blind population who may have very different or conflicting views about what benefits would make this technology worth it to them, and whether they would kind of adopt it themselves. With that, I'll just share one last quote at the top from one of the participants in this trial. And it's about why did they participate? And and the individual said, at that stage, when they were approached to participate, my reasoning was that I'm not going to get any more blind than I am. I'm totally blind. So I don't really have anything to lose and everything to gain. So that was my reasoning. It's worth a shot. And I want to kind of stop there. I'm really grateful for the chance to be able to talk about some of these things with this audience. I'm happy to take some questions. I suppose I'll leave this up. I think this could be just kind of questions that my lab sees as the really fundamental next steps in some of this research. Really asking at what point should some of these ethical questions be talked about? What's the, how early should we be talking about them? I think you can probably tell what my view is. It's as early as possible. What's the kind of role of engaging with technology developers and asking these questions? As you can guess, I probably think that role is huge. How can we bring participants into the research study? And lastly, I think really answering these questions in responsible ways requires a kind of humility and openness about technology and neurotechnology. And it requires a real openness to the possibility that some tech should not be developed, some technology should not be used, and that we may actually fundamentally need to change the way that we do research with these populations. All right. Thanks, everybody. I think we have